Trust me, you won't forget this one. A woman screamed, "Poisoner," across a dinner table full of the richest people in Connecticut, and pointed straight at the maid standing by the door. Everyone turned. Cameras came out. The maid didn't even open her mouth to defend herself. She just stood there, hands shaking, eyes down. But the billionaire sitting at the head of that table had already seen something nobody else noticed. And when he finally stood up and spoke, the whole room went dead silent. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is the place for real, emotional, true-to-life stories that stick with you long after the video ends. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from today? I love seeing where all of you are tuning in from. This one's a story about class, cruelty, and the quiet kind of courage that changes everything, and I promise, the ending is going to hit you harder than you expect. Let's get into it. She had learned a long time ago that silence could be its own kind of survival. The Whitfield Cross estate sat at the top of a long gravel drive in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of house that made even grown adults lower their voices when they walked through the front door. Marble floors, a staircase that curved like something out of an old movie, chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses. And in the middle of all that glittering excess, moving quietly between the kitchen and the dining hall with a tray balanced on one arm, was Elena Cruz. Elena was 28 years old, and for the past 3 years, she had worked as a housemaid for the Cross family. Before that, she had trained at a small culinary school in Hartford, dreaming of opening her own little bakery someday, something warm and modest, with a bell on the door and the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting onto the sidewalk. But dreams like that took money Elena didn't have, and after her mother got sick, all of Elena's savings went into hospital bills instead of flour and sugar. Her mother passed 2 years ago. Elena still kept a photo of her tucked behind her phone case, a woman with the same tired, kind eyes Elena saw in the mirror every morning. Now it was just Elena and her little brother Mateo, 16 years old, and growing so fast his sneakers seemed to wear out every few months. Elena worked long hours at the estate so Mateo could stay in school, play baseball on the weekends, and not have to worry about things a 16-year-old shouldn't have to worry about. She never complained. She just worked early mornings, long nights, and every holiday the Cross family hosted a party, which lately felt like most of them. Nathaniel Cross, the man who owned the estate, was 34, and he was not what people expected when they heard the word billionaire. He'd inherited his father's investment firm at 26, but he still remembered what it felt like to eat ramen out of a dorm microwave and count quarters for laundry. He was quiet, thoughtful, and paid more attention to the people working in his house than most of his own family did. He always said good morning to Elena by name. He asked about Mateo's baseball games. Small things. But to Elena, small things from a man like that meant more than she let herself admit. Tonight was the engagement party. Nathaniel was set to marry Victoria Hale, 29, a woman from an old money family in Manhattan whose father sat on 3 different boards Nathaniel's company did business with. Victoria was beautiful in the practiced way, every hair in place, every dress tailored to the inch. She smiled easily in front of cameras and guests. But Elena had noticed things over the past few months that made her uneasy. The way Victoria's smile dropped the second no one important was looking. The way she spoke to the staff, sharp, clipped, like they were furniture that occasionally needed reminding of its place. Careful with that. Victoria had snapped at Elena just an hour earlier, when Elena carried in a crystal vase of white peonies for the table centerpiece. If you break something in this house, it comes out of your paycheck. I made sure of that with Nathaniel. Elena had simply nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am," the way she always did. Mateo needed new cleats next month. She couldn't afford pride. The dining hall tonight was filled with nearly 60 guests, business partners, socialites, Victoria's parents, a handful of Nathaniel's cousins who only showed up for free champagne. Elena had spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen with the head chef, plating appetizers, carrying trays of seared scallops and truffle risotto, refilling wine glasses without ever making eye contact for too long. It was the unspoken rule of the job, be present, but invisible. As the first course wrapped up, Elena noticed something odd. Victoria had asked, very specifically, that a particular dessert, a delicate chocolate mousse with raspberry coulis, be served only to a small group at the head table, including herself, Nathaniel, and Victoria's parents. Elena hadn't questioned it. Rich families had strange rules about food sometimes, allergies, diets, whatever. She'd carried the tray in herself, set each glass dessert cup down with careful hands, and stepped back toward the wall to wait. She didn't notice Victoria excuse herself to the restroom just before dessert was served. She didn't notice the small vial that had been slipped from Victoria's clutch purse into her palm. Nobody did. The dining hall buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. String lights glittered above the long table. Nathaniel stood to give a toast, thanking everyone for coming, his eyes briefly finding Elena's across the room, a small, grateful nod, the kind he always gave the staff after a long night. Elena looked away quickly, her cheeks warming. Then Victoria's mother, Diane Hale, took a bite of the mousse. Within minutes, she was clutching her throat, gasping, her face turning a mottled red. Chairs scraped back. Someone screamed for a doctor. Nathaniel was at her side instantly, loosening her collar, shouting for the housekeeper to call 911. Diane's breathing came in ragged, wheezing pulls, and for a moment, the entire glittering room felt like it might collapse into chaos. And then Victoria turned, slowly, deliberately, and her eyes locked onto Elena standing frozen by the wall. "It was her," Victoria said, her voice rising, shaking with what looked like grief but sounded, underneath, almost rehearsed. "She served the dessert. She's the only one who touched it." The room went still. "You're a poisoner," Victoria screamed, pointing directly at Elena, tears streaking down her perfectly powdered face. "You did this to my mother." 60 pairs of eyes turned to Elena at once. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her hands were shaking so badly the empty tray she was holding rattled against her fingers. Somewhere behind her, she heard Mateo's name in her own head, a stupid, desperate thought in the middle of chaos. Don't let them take this job. Don't let him lose everything because of this. But no one was listening to what Elena might say. They were only listening to the accusation already ringing through the marble hall, growing louder with every second, wrapping around her like a rope she hadn't seen coming. Nobody in that room knew Nathaniel had already started asking questions. Paramedics arrived within 11 minutes. Diane Hale was stabilized quickly. It turned out to be a severe but survivable reaction, not the poisoning Victoria had screamed about, but by then it hardly mattered. The word had already detonated across the room like a bomb. Poisoner. It didn't matter that no test had confirmed anything yet. It didn't matter that Elena hadn't said a single word in her own defense. The accusation had already done its damage. Guests whispered behind raised hands. A few reached for their phones, recording the chaos, capturing Elena's pale, frozen face for whatever story this would become online by morning. Victoria's father, Richard Hale, a stern man who ran a hedge fund and rarely raised his voice, was suddenly standing very close to Elena, his jaw tight. "Someone needs to call the police," he said. "Now." "No one is calling anyone yet." Nathaniel's voice cut through the room, calm but iron-edged. He had one arm still steadying Diane as the paramedics loaded her onto a gurney, but his eyes were already on Elena, not with suspicion, but with something closer to disbelief that this was happening at all. "We don't know what caused this reaction. Let the paramedics do their job first." She served the dessert. Victoria snapped, wiping at eyes that, to anyone paying close attention, weren't actually producing tears. Who else could it have been? Elena still hadn't moved. She stood with her back nearly against the wall, the tray clutched to her chest like a shield. Every instinct pulled her to apologize, to explain, to do something, but her mind had gone terrifyingly blank, the way it used to when she was a little girl and her stepfather would raise his voice over something that wasn't her fault. She hated that old, familiar shrinking feeling. She hated that it still lived in her body after all these years. "I didn't put anything in that food," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would never." "Of course you'd say that," Victoria interrupted, her tone sharpening into something almost triumphant. "You've been strange around this family for months. Always hovering. Always watching my fiancé a little too closely." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Elena felt her face go hot with humiliation, understanding exactly what Victoria was implying and exactly how effective it was. It wasn't really about the moose anymore. It was about making Elena small enough, suspicious enough, foreign enough, that no one in that room would think twice about believing the worst. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Victoria, that's enough. Enough. Victoria rounded on him, her voice cracking with practiced outrage. My mother almost died, Nathaniel, and you're defending the help? The word landed like a slap. A few guests actually gasped. Even some of Victoria's own friends looked uncomfortable, glancing at each other, unsure where to put their eyes. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He walked over to the head table, where the dessert cups still sat. 5 of them, only 2 touched. He picked up Diane's cup carefully, studying the remains of the mousse, the faint residue along the rim. Something in his expression shifted, thoughtful and quiet, the look of a man doing math in his head that no one else in the room could see yet. I want this kept exactly as it is, he said finally, motioning to the head housekeeper. Nobody touches these cups. Nobody clears this table. Why does that matter? Victoria's mother's assistant asked nervously, hovering near the door. Because, Nathaniel said, his voice quiet but absolute, I intend to find out exactly what happened here. Not what people assume happened. What actually happened. Victoria's eyes flickered, just for a second, so brief that only someone looking very closely would have caught it. But Elena caught it. Standing against that wall, humiliated and shaking, Elena saw something pass over Victoria's face that didn't look like grief at all. It looked like fear. The party did not officially end, but it dissolved anyway. Guests trickling toward the door in uneasy clusters, whispering about what they'd witnessed, already composing the story they'd tell their friends tomorrow. You won't believe what happened at the cross-engagement party. Elena stood frozen for nearly 20 minutes after the last guest left, until the head housekeeper, an older woman named Dolores who had worked for the family for over a decade, gently took the tray from Elena's hands. Go home, honey, Dolores said softly. Get some rest. This isn't over, but it's not going to be solved tonight. Am I fired? Elena asked, her voice small. Dolores hesitated. That's not up to me. But I'll tell you this, Mr. Cross doesn't strike me as a man who jumps to conclusions. Not like some people in that room. Elena drove home that night with her hands trembling on the steering wheel, replaying every second of the evening, searching for some explanation, some detail she might have missed. She hadn't touched anything strange. She'd followed the recipe exactly, plated the desserts exactly as instructed, carried them out exactly as she always did. Matteo was waiting up for her when she got home, sitting at their small kitchen table with his homework spread out, a bowl of cereal serving as his dinner. He took one look at his sister's face and immediately stood up. What happened? Elena tried to smile, tried to make her voice light. Nothing, just a long night. But Matteo wasn't 16 for nothing. He'd grown up watching his sister carry more than any person her age should have to carry alone, and he knew the particular exhaustion in her eyes wasn't just about long hours. Elena, he said quietly. What happened? She sat down across from him, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Cruz put her face in her hands and let herself cry. Meanwhile, back at the Cross estate, long after the last car had pulled away down the gravel drive, Nathaniel Cross sat alone in his study with the security footage from the dining hall pulled up on his laptop screen, scrubbing slowly through the hours leading up to dessert service, watching every single frame with the focused patience of a man who already suspected the truth would not be what everyone in that room believed it to be. And then, in the quiet of that study, everything changed in a single moment. Nathaniel had barely slept. By 6 in the morning, he was still in the same chair, a cold cup of coffee forgotten beside his laptop, his eyes burning from hours of watching grainy security footage frame by frame. The estate had 12 cameras covering the kitchen, the hallway leading to the dining room, and the pantry where the desserts had been prepared and stored before service. He'd watched Elena carry the tray in. He'd watched her hands, steady, careful, exactly as they always were. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. But he kept rewinding to one specific stretch of footage, 11 minutes, right before dessert service, when the hallway camera showed Victoria stepping away from the head table and walking toward the pantry corridor, alone, her clutched purse held tightly against her side. At first, Nathaniel told himself it meant nothing. Victoria excused herself all the time, to check her makeup, to take a call, to escape the noise of a crowded room for a few minutes of quiet. He didn't want to believe what some quiet, cold part of his mind was already beginning to suspect. He kept watching. At the 11-minute 40-second mark, Victoria paused just outside the pantry door, the exact room where the dessert cup sat, uncovered, cooling on a marble counter before Elena arrived to plate them. Victoria glanced left, then right, checking the hallway. Then she slipped inside for exactly 43 seconds. Nathaniel's stomach turned to ice. He pulled up the interior pantry camera, a small unit he'd installed months ago after a string of minor thefts among rotating catering staff, something he'd nearly forgotten existed. The footage was low resolution, slightly grainy, but unmistakable. Victoria walked directly to the tray of dessert cups. She reached into her clutch. She pulled out a small glass vial, and with quick, practiced movements, she added several drops of clear liquid into 2 of the 5 cups, the 2 that would later be placed directly in front of her mother and, Nathaniel now realized with a sickening lurch, directly in front of himself. He watched it 3 more times, hoping each time that he'd misread it, that there was some other explanation. There wasn't. By 7 that morning, Nathaniel had already called a private toxicologist, a former colleague from his college years who now consulted for pharmaceutical companies. He drove the remaining, untouched dessert cup to the man's lab personally, along with a small sample he'd carefully preserved from the vial Victoria had discarded, badly hidden, in the pantry trash can, which he'd retrieved himself before the housekeeping staff could empty it that morning. The results came back within hours. A mild but potent compound, commonly used in low doses for allergy testing, capable of producing a severe but rarely fatal reaction in someone with Diane Hale's specific sensitivities that, as it turned out, only Victoria and her immediate family would have known about. Nathaniel sat with that information for a long time, staring at it, feeling something in his chest crack open. Not just anger, but grief. Grief for the 2 years he'd spent with a woman he thought he knew. Grief for how easily she'd been willing to destroy an innocent person's life to protect herself. Because that was the part that made him feel physically ill. This hadn't been about hurting her own mother. Diane's reaction, the actual severity of it, had clearly been unintended, perhaps even a miscalculation of dosage, or an allergy Victoria hadn't fully accounted for. But the intent, the plan itself, had likely been about something else entirely. He remembered, suddenly, a conversation from 3 weeks earlier. Victoria, complaining bitterly after a dinner where Nathaniel had spent 20 minutes at the door talking with Elena about Mateo's baseball scholarship, helping her fill out a financial aid form on his phone because she'd mentioned, in passing, not knowing where to start. "You spend more time worrying about the maid's little brother than you do about our wedding seating chart," Victoria had snapped that night, only half joking, though the edge in her voice had been unmistakable even then. Nathaniel hadn't thought much of it at the time. He'd chalked it up to wedding stress, to Victoria simply being tired. Now, sitting in his study with toxicology results in his hand, he understood it differently. Victoria hadn't just been jealous of the attention. She'd seen Elena as a threat, not romantically, not really, but as a kind of quiet moral contrast that made her own coldness more visible by comparison. And rather than confront that discomfort honestly, she'd found a way to eliminate it. Poison the dessert. Blame the maid. Watch her get fired, publicly humiliated, maybe even arrested. Problem solved. Except it hadn't gone according to plan. Diane's reaction had been more severe than Victoria likely anticipated, turning a calculated cruelty into something that had genuinely terrified her, and in that terror, she'd leaned even harder into the accusation, needing Elena's guilt to be true in order for her own panic to make sense. Nathaniel closed his laptop and sat in the silence of his study for a long time, feeling the full weight of what he now had to do. He thought about Elena, 28 years old, raising her brother alone, standing frozen against that wall last night while an entire room of wealthy strangers looked at her like she was something dangerous, something less than human. He thought about how she hadn't screamed, hadn't defended herself loudly, hadn't done anything except absorb the accusation with the quiet, practiced resignation of someone who had learned a long time ago that people like her weren't given the benefit of the doubt. That thought made something harden in Nathaniel's chest. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer first, then his head of security, then, after a long pause, his hand hovering over the screen, Elena herself, though it took him 3 tries before he could bring himself to actually place the call, unsure of what to say to a woman he had, however unintentionally, allowed to be humiliated in his own home. She didn't pick up the first 2 times. On the third, her voice came through small and guarded. "Mr. Cross?" "Elena," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I need you to come back to the house today. Not to clean. Not to work. I need you to hear something directly from me, before anyone else tries to tell you a different version of it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Am I in trouble?" Elena asked quietly, and something about the fear in that question made Nathaniel close his eyes. "No," he said. "You are never in trouble. I need you to trust me on that. But there's something I have to make right, and I need you there when I do it." She walked back into that house not knowing if she still had a job or a future. Elena stood at the base of the gravel driveway for almost a full minute before she made herself walk up to the front door. Her hands were cold despite the warm afternoon sun. Mateo had wanted to come with her. "I'll wait in the car, I just don't want you going in there alone," and she'd let him, mostly because she didn't have the strength left to argue. Dolores opened the door before Elena even knocked, her face soft with something that looked almost like relief. "He's in the study. He's been waiting for you." The house felt different in daylight, quieter, stripped of the glittering chaos from the night before. As Elena walked down the long hallway, she passed the dining room where it had all happened, the head table now bare, the chandeliers dark. It looked almost ordinary. It was strange how a room could hold something so devastating and still just look like furniture and glass the next morning. Nathaniel was standing when she entered his study, not sitting behind his desk the way she'd expected, but near the window, his hands in his pockets, his face tired in a way she'd never seen on him before. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Not just for last night. For not stepping in faster. For letting that room turn on you before I understood what was actually happening." Elena's throat tightened. "You don't have to." "I do," he said, cutting her off gently. "Please, let me say this." He told her everything, the security footage, the pantry camera she hadn't known existed, the vial, the toxicology results, the 11-minute 43-second window that had unraveled an entire evening of assumptions. Elena listened in silence, her hands pressed together in her lap, feeling something complicated rise in her chest. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a strange, disorienting mixture of vindication and grief. "She really did that," Elena said quietly, more to herself than to him. "She really stood there and screamed at me, knowing the whole time." "Yes," Nathaniel said, his voice hard. "She did." Elena looked down at her hands. "Why?" "I never did anything to her. I barely spoke to her unless she spoke first." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "she saw something in the way I treated you, the way I treat the people who work in this house, that made her feel small by comparison. And instead of examining that, she decided it would be easier to remove the person causing the discomfort. By destroying my life," Elena said, and for the first time, her voice cracked with something closer to anger than fear. "I won't let that happen," Nathaniel said immediately. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. The toxicology report, the footage, it's all being handed over to the appropriate authorities today. Victoria will be formally charged. The engagement is over. I ended it this morning." Elena stared at him, searching his face for some sign that this was simply damage control, some calculated move to protect his own reputation rather than genuine conviction. But there was nothing performative in the exhaustion etched into his features, nothing rehearsed in the way his jaw tightened when he spoke Victoria's name. "I also want you to know," Nathaniel continued, That whatever consequences come from this, whatever the Hale family tries to do, whatever they say to the press, whatever ugly version of this story they try to spin, you will not lose your job. You will not lose your reputation. I'll make sure of that personally, publicly if I have to. Elena felt tears sting her eyes, and she hated how quickly they came, how close to the surface all of last night's humiliation still sat. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "I'm just—" "Don't," Nathaniel said quietly, stepping closer. "Don't finish that sentence the way I think you're about to." Elena swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I'm the maid," she said anyway, quietly. "In a room full of people like her, like all of them last night. That's all I am to most of them. You know that." "That's not what you are to me," Nathaniel said, his voice low and steady. "You never have been. I've watched you work in this house for 3 years. I've watched you raise your brother practically alone, hold down 2 jobs some months, never once complain, never once ask this family for a single thing you weren't already owed. Victoria stood in that dining room last night and screamed an accusation at the most honest person in the building, and everyone believed her instantly, simply because of where you stand in this house and where she stands. That's not a reflection of you, Elena. That's a reflection of everyone who is too comfortable to ask a single real question before condemning you." Elena didn't trust herself to speak. She simply nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes, embarrassed by how much his words had undone her. "There's something else," Nathaniel said, more gently now. "I know this doesn't erase what happened last night. Nothing can. But I don't want you working under conditions where something like this could ever happen to you again, where your safety and reputation depend on the goodwill of people who clearly don't deserve to hold that kind of power over your life." He walked to his desk and picked up a folder, holding it out to her. Elena took it hesitantly, opening it to find a formal offer, not for a housekeeping position, but for a management role overseeing staff operations across 2 of his properties, complete with a salary that made her breath catch in her throat, along with a note about educational assistance for Mateo's college tuition down the line. "You don't have to accept," Nathaniel said quickly, watching her expression. "And I don't want you to think this is charity or an apology dressed up as a gift. I've watched how you run things in this house for 3 years, quietly, efficiently, better than half the management staff I actually pay to manage things. This is a job you've already been doing without the title or the pay that should come with it." Elena stared down at the paper, her hands trembling slightly, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not quite hope yet, but something close enough to touch. "I need to think about it," she said quietly. "Take all the time you need," Nathaniel said. "But Elena, whatever you decide, know that what happened last night is going to be corrected publicly and completely. Nobody is going to walk away believing a lie about you. I won't allow it." Outside, in the driveway, Mateo sat in the passenger seat of their old car, watching the front door, wondering what was happening behind it, unaware that in a few hours, the story that had exploded across half of Greenwich's social circles by morning would begin to unravel in an entirely different direction than anyone at that dinner table had expected. What happened next, nobody at that party could have predicted, least of all Victoria. The truth came out 3 days later, and it came out publicly because Nathaniel Cross made certain that it did. He didn't do it through gossip or whispered corrections passed quietly among friends. He did it the same way the accusation had been made, in front of people where it could not be misunderstood or softened into something smaller than it was. He hosted a follow-up gathering at the estate, framed simply as an update for those who were present at the engagement dinner, and nearly 50 of the original 60 guests came, curiosity outweighing any discomfort. Elena wasn't there as staff that evening. She stood near the back of the room in a simple navy dress, Mateo beside her, both of them uncertain, until Nathaniel gently but firmly asked her to come stand beside him at the front. 3 nights ago, Nathaniel began, his voice carrying easily across the room, an accusation was made in this house against a woman who has worked here faithfully for 3 years. She was called a poisoner in front of dozens of people without a single shred of evidence, based entirely on assumption, an assumption made easier, I think, by the fact that she is a housekeeper and the person accusing her is not. A ripple moved through the crowd. Somewhere near the door, Richard Hale shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Nathaniel continued, laying out the truth methodically. The security footage, the pantry camera, the toxicology results, the 11 minutes that changed everything. He didn't raise his voice.
He didn't need to.
The silence in the room grew heavier with every detail, until finally, he said the words that landed like a stone dropped into still water. The person who poisoned that dessert was Victoria Hale, my former fiancée.
Gasps.
A few guests actually covered their mouths. Diane Hale, still recovering, sat frozen in her chair, her hand pressed to her chest, staring at her daughter, who was not present, having already retreated to her family's Manhattan apartment under the advice of a lawyer, following formal charges filed earlier that week. Elena Cruz, Nathaniel said, turning toward her, did nothing wrong. She has never done anything wrong in this house. And I am deeply sorry that it took this long, and this much humiliation on her part, for the truth to be taken seriously. He turned back to the room. I wanted every person who was in this house 3 nights ago to hear this directly from me, in the same room where the lie was told, so that the truth carries at least as much weight as the accusation did. Elena stood beside him, her chin lifted slightly, tears standing in her eyes but not falling, not out of sadness now, but something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like being seen. Later that night, after the guests had gone, after Diane Hale had quietly approached Elena and, with tears in her own eyes, apologized for a daughter she clearly hadn't fully understood, Elena sat with Matteo on the back terrace of the estate, looking out over the dark, quiet lawn. You okay? Matteo asked, nudging her shoulder. Elena smiled, a real one, tired but real. I think I will be. She thought about her mother, about the photo tucked behind her phone case, about all the years she'd spent believing that keeping her head down and working twice as hard as everyone else was the only kind of safety available to someone like her. She realized, sitting there under the quiet Connecticut sky, that safety had never really come from silence at all. It had come, finally, from someone willing to tell the truth loudly enough that it couldn't be ignored. Elena did accept the management position, though it took her a full week of careful consideration, several long conversations with Matteo, and one honest conversation with Nathaniel about boundaries, professionalism, and what she needed to feel secure in a role that had nearly cost her everything before it began. 6 months later, Matteo started his freshman year of college on a partial scholarship, the rest quietly covered through the educational fund Nathaniel had set up, not as a gift from a billionaire to a maid, but as an investment, he insisted, in someone who had more than earned it. Victoria Hale eventually accepted a plea agreement, avoiding significant jail time but losing her standing in the social circles she'd spent her entire life curating, a quieter, more private kind of consequence that, in some ways, cost her far more than a courtroom ever could. And Elena Cruz, who had once believed that people like her were simply meant to stay small and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps of decency came their way, learned something different that year. That dignity was never something that had to be earned through someone else's permission. It had been hers all along. It just took one honest person in one honest moment to make the rest of the room finally see it. The lesson in all of this was simple, though it took a poisoned dessert and a public humiliation to teach it. Never mistake someone's silence for guilt, and never mistake someone's position for their worth. The truth always finds its way to the surface eventually, but it shouldn't take a billionaire's security footage for a good, honest person to be believed. To everyone watching this story tonight, if it moved you even a little, I hope you carry a piece of it with you. Look a little closer at the people the world tells you to overlook. You never know whose quiet strength is holding up more than anyone around them realizes. If this story hit you the way it hit me while writing it, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories like Elena's. If you want more real, emotional stories like this one every single week, go ahead and subscribe because we're just getting started. I want to know, what part of this story got you the most? Was it the accusation, the twist, or that final moment in the dining room? Drop in the comments. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that the truth always comes out eventually, send this one their way. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.